everybody. Welcome to the library. Thanks for coming out this evening as part of our event that celebrates Black History Month. We're happy you're here. We are honored to have received an Indiana Humanities grant to bring Dr. Leah Milne. Milne? Milne, all right, I got it right the first time. Here this evening. We have also put together an exhibit right over there at the top of the stairs of her book recommendations, so please check those out. There are two displays downstairs as well. We have the Advancing Racial Equity collection that was also courtesy of a grant from the Indiana Humanities, so we're very grateful for that, and selected works from our own collection in honor of Black History Month. We strive to expand our holdings to reflect all points of view in today's complicated world. For tonight's event in particular, we love it when people come and talk about reading, and empathy is always good to have thrown in there as well. We need a little bit more of that in the world. I did want to mention that we appreciate your land acknowledgement and that we share several commonalities. Leah is from Indianapolis, came from Indianapolis. She's not from Indianapolis. There's plenty of time at the end for questions and lively discussion, so save those for the end. We hope you will participate. And I'd like to introduce Kennedy Burrows. Come on up. A Hanover senior and president of both the Black Student Union and Sister to Sister, right? Welcome, Kennedy. Come on and take it away. I'm going to grab my phone.
Thank you, Kelly, for the wonderful introduction, and welcome to our library. Tonight we are coming together thanks to a collaboration between faculty and students, departments and offices, committees and individuals to welcome Dr. Leah Milne to Hanover. Dr. Milne is an associate professor of English and director of graduate studies at the University of Indianapolis. Her specialties are contemporary multi-ethnic American literature, authorship, and metafiction, race and ethnicity, young adult literature, and Afrofuturism. She teaches, among other amazing artists and writers, Beyonce and Percival Everett, Toni Morrison, and Ruth Ozeki. Many of you are familiar with their works. Her articles have appeared in Newsweek, Ms. Magazine, and The Hill, as well as academic journals like African American Review and the Journal of American Culture. Dr. Milne speaks to many audiences in varying contexts and in different ways. Her book, Novel Subjects, invites us to reconsider how authors, writers, narrators of marked backgrounds forge, claim, and create spaces for their voices and presences in an often inhospitable culture. Writers want to be in community with readers. Tonight, Dr. Milne will discuss ways in which we as readers can be in community with writers, characters, and cultures through reading empathetically, but also how we as readers can push boundaries to approach and connect with radically different worlds and stories. Mirrors and Windows investigates the relationships between reading and empathy and how we help constitute them. Please welcome Dr. Milne.
Everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Kelly Kennedy, for introducing me. Thank you to Ushi for being such a great host for this event, and to everybody here at Hanover College. I feel like I applied for a job and I'm on a campus visit. It's been very exciting and strange. Anyway, so I also want to thank Indiana Humanities, the Advancing Racial Equity program. I've benefited so much from Indiana Humanities. If you don't know who our state council is, they do such amazing work. I've lived in a few states, actually, and they're probably like the best state council. That you guys are so lucky to have the Humanities State Council that we do have. So if you see them around, you know, obviously they're here and helping you guys out with so many things. It's just a really great organization. So this is my talk, Mirrors and Windows, Reading for and Beyond Empathy. I put my email address there because I want all of you to email me. I was telling a few of the faculty members earlier, one of my favorite things to do is give recommendations for books, and I like to tailor my recommendations to the person. So email me and I will give you a recommendation. That's my promise today. So this is my talk. A lot of my graphics come from a couple of websites that I would recommend. One is called the Empathy Lab, which is out of the UK and does a lot of work with thinking about empathy and reading through the lens of K-12 books. And then another source for a lot of my graphics that aren't the graphs, I'll show you where those come from in a second, but a lot of my other graphics come from We Need Diverse Books, which is a really excellent organization. They do a lot of really good work, again, especially with that K-12 demographic in terms of thinking how to read more diversely, not just in terms of race, but ability, sexuality, and so on. So I will start by introducing us to a reader who for now we will call Jay. And Jay's interesting for all kinds of reasons, but one of the most interesting things about him as far as we're concerned today is that he was 17 the first time he read a book from cover to cover. And this is not something he brags about. In fact, there's a few interviews where he talks about this. And in one of those, he says that this thing of his, that he hadn't read a book from cover to cover until he was much later in his life as a teenager, he says, it's not something I'm proud of. It's not cool. The truth is my life was made infinitely more difficult because I didn't read any books. So the biggest reason why Jay took so long to read a book, I don't know what's happening right now, is because of this concept that we're talking about here, the idea of mirrors and windows. And this is why, as a reader, Jay kind of had a hard time figuring out how he could actually get into books. So let me skip back to that slide. This concept comes from a woman who is known as the mother of multicultural literature, and her name is Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. So she states that books are sometimes windows, offering views of worlds that may be real or imagined, familiar or strange. These windows are also sliding glass doors, and readers have only to walk through in imagination to become part of whatever world has been created or recreated by the author, right? So we've got windows, we've got sliding glass doors in which you can enter, and then finally, most importantly to somebody like Jay, when the lighting conditions are just right, however, a window can also be a mirror. Literature transforms human experiences and reflects it back to us. And then reading becomes a means of self-affirmation. Readers often seek their mirrors in books. Now, this was very true of Jay, and I think it's probably true for a lot of us. And one of the things that we have to think about with this concept of mirrors and windows is how hard does one have to work to find mirrors in their own lives, in their own books. I actually first heard of this concept that Dr. Bishop came up with through this person. So this was a TED Talk by author Grace Lin, and you can see one of her most famous books there called Where the Mountain Meets the Moon. The title of her talk is called The Windows and Mirrors of Your Child's Bookshelf. And here's what she said. She said quite a few interesting things, but this really resonated with me because I just really felt this really hard. She said, it seemed like there was nobody that looked like me anywhere. Nobody that looked like me in school, nobody that looked like me in the movies, nobody that looked like me on TV or in the magazines, and most importantly, there was nobody that looked like me in the books that I loved. Now, one difference between Grace Lin and me versus Jay is that again, in terms of how hard one has to work, in her case, she was willing to hustle, right? So she was willing to kind of try to find herself in these books that were given to her, even though they didn't actually reflect her. This is why she ended up writing so prolifically. These are some of her books, just a few. I highly recommend the one on Maya Lin, who created the Vietnam War Memorial in D.C. And so she says that my books, meaning the ones that Grace Lin wrote, are the books that I wish I had when I was a child. So children's books in particular are really important mirrors in reflecting our lives and experiences. And so I wanted to give you some statistics. So this comes out of the Cooperative Children's Book Center, which is in the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And they did this over a number of years where they would look at the number of children's books that were published in a particular year. And then they would assess them based on their representation. They give you animals as a comparison. And then I want to direct us to the right of this graphic because when we're talking about children's books as mirrors, one of the things that stood out to me was just the variety, right? So not just mirrors of white children, but mirrors of white children as astronauts or as kings, or as firemen. I'm not sure what the disco ball is, but like all these other representations, and there's a variety of them. And something I tell my students a lot when we're thinking about this idea of mirrors is that we don't have to be told, none of us have to be told that white people do different things. Because all you had to do was turn on the TV, right? And there's just a variety of people doing a variety of things in a variety of professions. But it's less true once you go down the line. So again, this is just 2018. I'll show you a more recent one in a second. But for example, right now I'm teaching a book by a Native American author. And with that book, I said, well, imagine that person reading as a young person. At 2018, only 1% of their books would have reflected them as a child. Okay. And again, I think this is really interesting in part because we have the comparison of animals, which can go either way, right? Like you can identify with an animal or you can't. And I want to kind of get back to this idea of labor. So how hard would a child, especially a child who's not motivated to read, how hard would they have to work in order to find mirrors in their books? So this is 2018 and this is 2020. For Black kids, we're looking at an increase of about 2%. And we can compare these to the census data to show that even if we're looking at census data, this is still not reflective of us as a society. Okay, so we can break this down. 41% white, 29% animals, 12% Black, 9% Asian, 6% Latinx, 3% disability. Native Americans have fallen into the other category to the point where I had to just give you guys what that looks like. 0.001% Pacific Islander, 0.15% Indigenous, 0.008% Arab. Okay. And you can actually kind of pull these up if you guys are interested in looking at the details further. It breaks it down by number of books as well and gives you some sample titles and so on. Okay. So we're going back to Jay, because by this point he's going to high school, and the mirrors don't get much better for him once he goes to high school. So this is what he said he was taught in high school. His teachers were into the classics. And keep in mind, there's absolutely nothing wrong with these. I know quite a few of you are into some of these books. So I'm not suggesting that we don't have to read Shakespeare anymore. But what I'm suggesting is for somebody like Jay, this really wasn't what he needed in life in order to become a lifelong reader, which is really what we all want, right? Like we just want people to become lifelong readers. So right, as a teenager, he was assigned Shakespeare. He was assigned William Golding's Lord of the Flies. He was assigned Moby Dick. And he kind of laughs in the interview because he says that the teacher kind of said, well, you should just read this book. It's about a man chasing a whale. And he said, I've never seen a whale before. I don't even know what they look like. And I don't really know how I'm supposed to connect with this. And so he goes on to say that really nothing that was happening in these books is happening in my neighborhood. Now, Jay is a very articulate guy. He says he knows what he needs in order to become a reader. And what he says is that all I needed was something familiar. A family like mine, a neighborhood like mine, language like mine. But it's unfair for me to say that teachers didn't try. So he recognizes there's a bigger problem here. It's hard to do when the options for books that I needed were so scarce. So if we kind of zoom out a little bit to look at beyond just children's books in high school, this is the graphic that started me on this journey with this talk. There was this impression, and I had this impression too. There was this impression that 2020, we're looking at post-George Floyd, post-Breonna Taylor, start of the pandemic, a lot of anti-Asian racism, and everybody was creating all these book groups, right? So everybody was reading, well, you can see some of the titles here if you guys recognize it. So everybody was reading Ibram X. Kendi, everybody was reading Michelle Obama. And so, especially for somebody like me who's in the field of multicultural American literature, there was this excitement in the air that maybe we were going to get people interested in our field, and that would include not just not just readers, but also publishers, maybe more teachers, right? So this is what it looked like. So a couple of guys who are really into collecting data, this is Dr. Richard Jean So and Gus Ozeki. They kind of tracked the bestsellers over the course of this momentous year. And here's what it looks like for authors of color. And then they zoomed out to include all the bestsellers by white authors in the same time period. And what we see here is very kind of reflective of the publishing industry as a whole, which I'll talk about in a second. And so while there were definitely kind of this increased interest in reading across different races or reading more diversely, there was still a lot of bestsellers that were being written by white authors. And so Erdrich and So, they decided to kind of zoom out even further and look over the course of publishing history and bestsellers from 1950 to 2018. Okay, so this is what this looks like. The gray here is bestsellers by white authors, and then the purple is where they've lumped together all the races that are not white, and so those are at the top. And then I think this last year here is 2018. So they give the statistics for 2018. So 89% were written by white writers. Just 11% of books in 2018 were written by, again, lumping all together the people of color. Okay, and you'll notice if you go back, there's some years where there's just none, right? And so this is what the publishing industry looks like if we're breaking it down by demographics of author. And of course, we know that the author's race doesn't directly indicate what the subject matter is going to be and so on. But this is still telling about who gets published and what kinds of stories are potentially being told. And with Erdrich and So, they suggested that part of this has to do with who is leading the publishing industry. So who are the executives running, say, the big five in the publishing industry, which includes, actually they're listed here, Simon & Schuster, Penguin, Random House, Doubleday, HarperCollins, and Macmillan. It includes the acquisition editors, the editors who decide which books get signed, and so on. And we actually have data for that too. So this comes from Lee and Lowe. And this is a publishing survey. They do this every few years, so I'm waiting for the next one, which should be coming out pretty soon. But they break it down by race, by gender, by sexual orientation, by disability. And they have it broken down also. You can kind of see at the top, it's a little bit small, but you can see they break it down by also like the leadership roles in publishing. And so this one's the executive level. All of the big five that we just talked about, all the executives of the big five all identify as white, and you can kind of see that reflected in this kind of larger picture here, which includes the big five plus a number of other publishers. And then you can kind of go down the line to see what you would expect, right? So 90% non-disabled, 10% disabled, for example. If we go to the editorial level, which includes your acquisition editors and your other editors, it looks very similar. And this from Lee and Lowe Books is actually voluntary. So they actually offered for publishers to opt in and provide their data voluntarily, and this is what it looks like for those who actually participated. Okay, so about 85% of editors identify as white. We were talking earlier about banned books, and this obviously complicates the issue, but then we can also see that if you look down the line as far as the percentage of banned content, and this is from 2021 to 2022, about 41% involves some kind of LGBTQ plus themes, 40% represent protagonists or prominent secondary characters of color. And so even just those two alone, again, if we go back to trying to create this sort of narrative of the publishing industry in terms of readers, in terms of who are the executives, who's in charge, and then which books are we trying to suppress, hopefully you're getting a bigger picture here of what this looks like when we're talking about race. And particularly what this looks like if we're talking about race in both directions, right? So if you're somebody like Jay, you're trying to find mirrors of yourself, you're gonna have a very hard time. On the other hand, if you're a reader who identifies with the majority, you're trying to find kind of representations to be a better person, to read other experiences, you're gonna have a hard time, right? So nobody really benefits from this. If we're trying to kind of be more ethical, more responsible readers, if we're trying to just push our comfort levels and read a bit more diversely. So before I get too far into this, we'll talk a little bit about empathy. hopefully you guys all think it's important, but it's important for us to have that discussion of why it's important. So I like to frame, this shouldn't surprise anybody, I like to frame empathy as reading. And so the way I define it is that empathy is a way of reading a person, a situation, a context, an environment, or a text. And text here could include anything from books, poems, short stories, and so on. The other really important part about empathy as reading is that it's reading that you have to do, it's lifelong reading, right? You have to constantly do it. And so I think it's really important, especially if we think back to that earlier graphic about the summer of 2020 and what those book groups were trying to do. Reading is an ongoing thing, right? So you can't just read one book, be woke, or whatever that means, and be done with that whole wokeness thing, right? So this is an ongoing thing. It means failing and trying and failing and trying over and over again, right? There's this pretty famous video by Drs. Brene Brown and Teresa Wiseman, and they give 4 conditions for empathy. So the first is the one that I think we kind of traditionally think of when we think about empathy. So this idea of walking a mile in somebody else's shoes or taking on someone else's perspective. This is a good reminder not to judge or assume. And I think this one is especially when we're thinking about kind of the work or the labor of empathy involves understanding that our reality is not the same as somebody else's reality. And that's really hard to do because our reality is so real. And then we have to kind of understand that somebody else might be standing right next to us and experiencing that reality differently, right? And so this is where we move on to more active forms of empathy, so recognizing, understanding one's emotions and feelings. They lump these together. I think the second one is harder than the first, so really understanding is where the work comes in for me. And then communicating your understanding, that's the scariest part, right? Because then you have to kind of admit that the thing that you're doing might not be right, but that you're going to try, right? So all really important stuff, and I highly recommend the video because it's got these really cute graphics. But I think we also have to be kind of careful about how we talk about empathy, because I think sometimes we talk about it as this universal cure-all that we just have to be empathetic and then that'll fix everything. And to a certain extent it does. These are all important life skills, job skills, professional skills, just human being skills, right? So being better listeners and speakers, being more creative and critical thinkers, being more compassionate. All really good things. And this is why this graphic, which is another one of the Empathy Lab graphics, has this quote from Chris Riddell, who says that reading allows us to see and understand the world through the eyes of others, and that makes a good book an empathy engine. And I think we can take this and we can say, okay, good book, empathy engine, got it. But now we have to do the thing that we always do, where we take something that feels really good and then we have to kind of problematize it a little bit because, we're all smart people and we can't just keep things as simple as they should be. And so let's talk about what empathy cannot do. And this is really important because this is where it gets a little tough, right? First of all, you can read as many books as you want, and you still won't completely understand what somebody else is experiencing. So you can read all of Moby Dick and all the scholarship surrounding Moby Dick. You can even visit a whaling ship, but you're still not going to completely understand what Captain Ahab was thinking, right? That's just fact. You can read all of Shakespeare and not understand what it was like to live in the late 1500s, right? So again, if we're thinking about this, especially in terms of reading, we have to be very mindful that we can read a lot of things we still won't understand the firsthand experience. You can't replace action. This is something that I think becomes really tricky when we read because reading feels like we're doing something. And that's something maybe even a very important emotional journey and maybe life-changing, but it's still not the same as action, right? And there's some statistics to prove this from that same time period that I was talking about, when everybody was reading all the books, right? And this is from the New York Times. Says Jennifer Chuddy, doctors Jennifer Chuddy and Hakeem Jefferson. And so they were tracking support for the Black Lives Matter movement. And you can see that there was definitely a rise. Again, this is like almost immediately post the murder of George Floyd. And they track it by race, but really like the trajectory for everybody kind of drops, right? Like we get kind of compassion, what is it? Like we like over labor with compassion for a bit, and then we kind of drop off. And in this case, what I think is fascinating is that sometimes we drop off to points where we're less supportive than we once were beforehand. So we get that kind of empathy fatigue, and then sometimes we never kind of work our way back. And so this is why I think it's important to kind of understand that feeling something is not the same as doing something. The other thing that empathy cannot do is replace logic. And this becomes really hard because I think for a lot of us, feelings feel like facts, and they're not, right? So there's a lot of studies. I could show you a bunch, but this one is like the most recent one I saw. So this is from the Washington Post, January 2024. The article is "Science is Revealing Why American Politics Are So Intensely Polarized." Really fascinating article that talks essentially about how feelings have replaced even our beliefs about policy, right? And so thinking about empathy not being able to replace logic is really interesting. They talk about a bunch of fascinating experiments. So this is one. It says experiments have revealed that children as young as 2 will prefer other children randomly assigned to the same T-shirt color. And I'm sure you guys have heard of some of these studies, you know, like eye color, for example, right? So there's this similarity bias that comes into play that somehow overrides our ability to even work logically through something like policy, okay? So again, empathy cannot replace logic. There's a bunch of essays that I would recommend related to this idea of the connections between empathy and reading. But I'll give you 2 of my favorites. So this first one is by this author, Namwali Serpell, who is really amazing. And I think especially if we're thinking about reading as empathy in terms of style, Serpell does some really interesting work with narrative and with playing with perspective that I think can kind of jar us into maybe thinking about reading in this form. But her essay actually pushes back against this notion that we can become more empathetic just by reading. It's called The Banality of Empathy. So here's one of my favorite quotes from it. So she says that narrative is an incredible vehicle for virtual experience. We think and feel with characters. And I mean, it's just like when you put on like VR goggles, right? Like you're thinking, you're feeling with them. It's really great in terms of kind of understanding a story. And she says it simulates empathy, so we believe it stimulates it. And this is where I was going with the idea that empathy cannot replace action, right? We feel like we've done something because we've gone on this emotional journey. And she says we have to be very mindful that that emotional journey is not the same as actually empathizing. She says, but if witnessing suffering firsthand doesn't spark good deeds, why do we think art about suffering will? She does not pull any punches, Namwali Serpell. She gets really into it. And if this isn't enough, she actually offers you a social experiment. So she says, let's say that you're walking around, there's this lake nearby where someone is drowning. Okay. And this is where she says maybe empathy isn't the first thing you should always go to. She says emotional empathy is often beside the point for moral action. You don't have to feel the suffocation, the clutch of a throat gasping for air to save someone. And so even if you are not an empathetic person in this situation, we don't need an empathetic person, we need somebody who's going to jump in the lake, right? And so thinking about like empathy is really important, but maybe not as important when something like this is urgently happening. One of my favorite people in general, but one of my favorite people who talks about empathy is Congressman John Lewis. I teach his graphic novel trilogy, March, almost every semester. And one of the things that he often talks about is how empathy requires active practice. And by active practice, he means active practice. So he means that that him and his fellow students on the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee would actually work through scenarios that pushed them to the limits of their empathy. And so this is from the graphic novel. This is from the book 1 of the graphic novel trilogy. And he says that we tried to do everything we could to test ourselves to break each other's spirits. And one of the things that he realizes is that empathy is so hard that some of us just aren't capable of doing it, and that's also okay. And so this is from that same situation. He said, the hardest part to learn to truly understand deep in your heart was how to find love for your attacker. And then you see a dialogue balloon kind of off the panel that says, do not let them shake your faith in nonviolence, love them. And this is the moment where he says that some people just couldn't do it and that they had to just be okay with that. Because, empathy takes work, and some of us are ready to do that work and some of us are not. Some of us think we are and then we fail. And so trying to kind of even workshop how to be more empathetic and to constantly practice that is something that for even somebody like John Lewis, who's kind of known for kind of his empathetic beliefs, like this is something that he had to work at. Okay, so back to Jay. This guy here, so this is Jay at age 6. And this is Jay at age 22. This is him with his mom. So 22, by this point, it's been like 5 years, right, since he first read a book from cover to cover. And he went on StoryCorps, which is this recording website that is radio. I don't know if you kids know what radio is. But he says to the interviewer, when the interviewer asks, what do you want to do with your life? He says, I want to be a writer. Again, 5 years after he read his first book from cover to cover, he's like, I want to be a writer. That's my ultimate goal. I want to shock the world. So this guy is Jason Reynolds. That's who we've been talking to. This is Jay. 2020 to 2022 National Ambassador for Young People's Literature, winner of the Coretta Scott King Award, the NAACP Image Award, the Carnegie Medal, which he happens to be wearing right there because he's so fancy. He's written a number of books. And I have some of them here. These are all by Jason Reynolds, and you'll see like the award emblems here. So this is the Coretta Scott King Award. This book, by the way, one of my students' favorites, All American Boys. Here's some more. He wrote, once they get famous enough, Marvel takes them, right? So he wrote a Miles Morales. Long Way Down, I highly recommend. It's really good. Anyway, all of these are great. But this is the guy who hadn't read a book that mirrored his life until he was 17. That's all he needed, right? And so here's what he says about books as mirrors. We all need to know how to read. Our children need to know how to navigate language because with words we can bolster self-confidence and cut down on almost every other interpersonal conflict. Look at the power that he attributes to reading, right? Cut down on almost every other interpersonal conflict. Stories, he says, are the imaginary friends that do real things. Okay. And I needed Jay here because I needed Jason Reynolds to remind us of this because I just gave you some stuff that makes me look like I'm kind of down on empathy or reading for empathy. But I still think it does important work. We just need to be, as I say on this slide, mindful about how we do that work, right? So yeah, let's talk about how to read mindfully for empathy. Again, with the caveat that reading can't be the end-all be-all. You might know this guy, so John Green. And I'm biased, so I just put my 3 favorite John Green books on here, even though I don't even know if those are the ones he's necessarily known for. The Anthropocene Reviewed got me through some tough times. It's if you guys haven't read this one, it's one that you can just read a little bit, like every night. One of those. Anyway, so you may have heard that, he had some pretty strong opinions about his books and others and the need to read them. And so he actually gives some advice that I think is really useful and that the librarians might like. So he says that one of the things you can do is depend on the expertise of librarians and teachers in our community, the highly trained experts at Fishers and Noblesville and Hanover and so on pay with public money to make educated decisions about books. And I always tell students, like if you're trying to figure out how to read empathetically but also still read something that you like, go to librarians, right? If you guys don't recognize where this quote is from, this is his open letter to the Indy Star when they tried to move his books out of the young adult lit section. Another suggestion I have, and I recommend everybody do this is character building. Read beyond your comfort level. I know we often read for comfort, and so this feels a little counterintuitive, but as I like to say, learning requires discomfort. Otherwise, you're not growing. And you don't have to work that hard, right? Like, you don't have to scare yourself that much. I think probably like a quick, fast rule to doing this is just to read something for which you are not the primary audience. Okay, we all know how books are marketed, and we all feel those good feelings when we see a book that clearly is written for us and that's being marketed by the publishing industry for us. And so maybe now's the case for you to go in a part of the bookstore or click on a different Amazon page or whatever you guys are doing. Just go somewhere else than where you normally go, right? So just a little bit off the beaten path. Another way to do this is to read something in translation, which I highly recommend. And that translation can be mostly translated, or it can be just, maybe you have to look up a word here and there. I know that's sometimes hard for us to do, but it's worth it. And then I think the other thing that might be useful for us to think about is to read something from another country. And there are lists out there, right? You don't have to do this work for yourself. You can ask librarians, but you can also just Google. There's groups on Goodreads, for example, about reading a book from every country, and they...
Foreign language teachers.
Yeah, so read something not for you, and you might be surprised. You might actually enjoy it. And again, this is all with the caveat that we have to be mindful, right? So we have to be mindful of how and why we read. And I'll give you my second. So I said there was two of my favorite essays. So this is my second favorite. They're both equally my favorite, but this is my second of my favorite essays about reading and empathy. So this is from an amazing book of essays by Elaine Castillo. She also wrote a novel called America Is Not the Heart, which is beautiful. And so she says that reading for empathy, that's great. But the problem with this type of reading is that usually readers are encouraged to read writers of a demographic minority in order to learn things, which is to say as a supplement for their empathy muscles. And so this can be a problem, right? So she says that sometimes what this means is that we're reading across our cultures in order to do something, she calls it an ethical protein shake, right? Like, we don't want to necessarily be reading just for that. Because the result is, as she says, that we largely end up going to writers of color to learn the specific and going to white writers to feel the universal. So really important tip, writers of color, they are not your tour guides, they're not your ethnographers, they're not your sole representation of entire countries, entire cultures, they're just writers. Just like any other writer, and they want to tell stories, right? And so I think part of this is just, when I say reading mindfully, is just thinking about why we go to any particular book, right? And hopefully it's not with this idea that I'm going to read a book and that person's going to be a tour guide for me into this culture or into this place, right? One way to do that is to check in with yourself regularly. So this is Megan Bowler, and her book is entitled Feeling Power. The subtitle is Emotions and Education. She calls this testimonial reading, which is one of the things that she suggests doing is noticing when you feel uncomfortable in your reading, and then to ask yourself why. And that may be different for all of us, right? There may be just something about it that we're unfamiliar with, or something about it that doesn't feel quite right. We may be reading outside of our genre, for example, and we just don't know how fantasy books work, right? It could be anything, but she says just kind of check in with yourself regularly as you read. And she says that this involves empathy, but requires the reader's responsibility, right? So we're thinking about the connections here between kind of empathy and action. The other thing that you can do is check in with others. And I would say to make this really work, check in with others who are similar to you in terms of their experience. So, I'll be frank, like I tell my students, my white students, I'm like, don't tell your black friends that you're reading a black book. Like, that's not the conversation you should be having. That's great, but you should really be having conversations with your other white friends about the black book that you're reading, right? Because that's where you kind of get to better understand what it is that you're feeling, what it is that they might be feeling. You get to kind of understand like where you are in terms of your empathy journey and in terms of your reading journey, right? So talk to others, especially others who have similar values as you, who have similar backgrounds. And then this comes from the Empathy Lab, though I've kind of refined it a little bit. So making an empathy resolution. And so they say that the first thing you want to do is think about your community. So think about your home, your school, wherever you think might need a little bit more empathy, and where you might be able to help, right? So part of this is thinking about just what you can contribute personally to make a difference. And that could be very small. There's like no... Empathy is one of those things that if you just do it a little bit more, like everybody starts to do it, right? So deciding like where you and kind of your strengths might best make a difference. And then I would say, so the Empathy Lab just says, just tell everybody. And I say, just tell a friend. You don't have to be performative about your empathy. You could just tell somebody who you care about, who will hopefully keep you accountable to just being better about it. And then their final resolution is to act. Act on your resolution now. So that is all I have. As I was saying earlier, I give book recommendations all the time. It's one of my favorite things to do. So I'm happy to do that or to answer any of your other questions during the Q&A. But yeah, thank you again for having me.